Hi, this is Raina from Mount Lebanon, Raina's to Go, where we're going to teach you a wonderful new class in bread baking today. We're going to take one basic recipe for you and turn it into two wonderful products. One is an gnocchi, which is an olive bread, and all that is your basic bread dough rolled out, and what we do is we fill it with a wonderful olive and onion mixture and roll it up and let it proof again, and when we bake it off and you slice it down, you have this wonderful olive filling encased in your bread dough. The second bread that we're going to be using from the same basic recipe is going to be a braided twist bread with sesame seeds. Now these breads, as in traditional Greek manner, are a little sweeter than most breads. They're wonderful toasted, they're wonderful eaten just plain, hot, buttered, anything you want, but the idea is that it's a fantastic bread that you'll probably always want to have on hand. And the nicest thing about these breads is that we can make the dough right in the Cuisinart. And I happen to like using that method because it sure beats sitting there and kneading it for 20 minutes. So if you'll all get your pencils and paper and get ready, we're going to start making the basic bread dough first. Now, in order to do any great bread, the first thing that you have to do is you have to have a good yeast. And since none of us are psychic, the only way we can test a good yeast is to proof it. The way you proof yeast is you incorporate a certain amount of yeast, and today we're using 2 packages of dry yeast in 1/2 cup of warm water. Now the idea with the water is that you don't want it to be too hot, because any water or any liquid that the yeast comes in contact with when it's too hot, all it'll do is kill your yeast. So the best way for you to test this is to go ahead and put your finger in it, and if your finger feels very comfortable but nice and warm in that water, then you know that it's the right temperature. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the 2 packages of dry yeast, but I've just put them in a measuring cup today to make it easier to pour, and 1 tablespoon of sugar. It is very important that you always use sugar when you're proofing yeast, because the sugar is the agent that is going to show you if the yeast is actually still good enough to use. So you're going to take that 1 tablespoon of sugar and stir it gently with a spoon. Now, once you've done that and you're sure that the sugar and the yeast are both dissolved in that nice warm water, you're going to let it sit out on a counter for just a few minutes. And if your yeast is good, it'll start to bubble. And that's called proofing my yeast. Make sure you get all the yeast off of the spoon, and unfortunately, guys, the only way to do that is with your finger. It gets very sticky, but you want to get every ounce of that yeast in your incorporation or in your proofing. Now, if you'll sit there, and hopefully you'll even be able to see it on the screen, ultimately it's going to start rising and bubbling all by itself, and it's the sugar that's doing that. And if you let it sit long enough, believe me, it'll literally rise right up and out of this cup and onto the counter and onto the floor. Then you know you've got great yeast. But you don't want to let that happen, because what happens is, of course, you've lost your yeast. In the meantime, using the Cuisinart or any food processor that you have, and as you'll notice, we have a nice big one here which helps. You can't use anything too tiny, and I use a steel blade. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering why, when there's a bread blade that's available with most food processors. I find that this can handle the bulk that we're going to make. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1 cup of sugar minus a tablespoon, because I've already used a tablespoon of that sugar to proof my yeast. And I'm going to put that in the Cuisinart along with 1 stick of butter and 1 cup of milk. I've gone ahead and I've heated my milk, and I've made it very, very hot. And that's okay, because my butter's very cold. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that butter right in that hot milk And the heat of the milk is going to eventually soften and probably even melt the butter. And that's just a step saver for you. While that's softening in that hot milk, and also cooling down the milk, because if it were too hot, as you'll recall earlier I said anything that's too hot will kill the yeast. So both things will be at the right temperature. I'm going ahead and I'm going to take 3 whole eggs right on top of the sugar and 2 egg yolks. And it would be a great idea if we didn't get any eggshells in our bread dough. And I have 2 whole eggs here, or 2 egg yolks, pardon me. So it's 3 whole eggs and 2 egg yolks. Then I'm going to take about 1.5 teaspoons of salt and put that in here. And one of the reasons I'm adding salt to my bread dough is because my butter is unsalted. So I'll need a little something to give it some flavor. And I'm going to take the milk that's already started melting the butter, and I'm going to put that in here. And as you can see, the yeast has already started to proof, and it's rising right there in the cup. That way I know now that the yeast is fine and I can go ahead and use it. If for some unforeseen reason your yeast isn't good and it doesn't rise in this cup, please don't go any further. Stop where you are, get 2 more packages of yeast and start again, because without the proper yeast, it's not going to raise. That goes in the Cuisinart too. Now, it's very hard for me to tell you exactly how much sugar you're going to use, or flour you're going to use. So rather than sit there and tell you you have to exactly use this many cups of flour, I'm going to tell you that you're looking at approximately 7 cups of sifted all-purpose flour. But you may only need 6.5. So rather than add too much, because it's always easier to add more than to take away, we're going to start out with 6 cups. And right here I have measured 6.5 cups, and I have more flour right here that I can pull from. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 cups of flour to start. And as you can see, I'm using very generous cups. That's because I've already measured the 6.5 cups, so I know what I have in there, and it doesn't really matter that my measurement be exact. And I'm going to put the lid on the food processor and start my machine. Now, the best thing for us to do is to take some kind of a spatula and scrape down the sides. And as you can see, this is very, very liquidy, and that's okay. That's what we want. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start adding the rest of the flour that's already been measured. And I had 6.5 cups, so I'm going to save just a little bit until the end. As you can see, this is way too sticky. So what I'm going to do now is start adding the rest of my flour. This completes 6.5 cups. As you can see also, the food processor is having a hard time accepting that, but it did in fact incorporate it. But it's still very, very sticky. So for this final preparation and final addition of our flour, we're going to have to flour our counter, take the bread dough out of the machine, and add the rest of the flour by hand. Probably no more than another ½ cup, which will take us to that original 7 cups I told you you were going to need. Here's my ½ cup of flour. That way we can have our measurement pretty accurate. And it's going to be a little tough to get out, and your hands are going to get sticky, and you have to be real careful here that you don't get your fingers crossed up in that blade. This sure beats sitting here and kneading it the way our grandmothers used to do how many years ago. And if you could have smell-o-vision, you know that this just already with that yeast smells so wonderful. And when it starts baking, I must tell you, it's probably the most comforting feeling to have it lingering in your house, that wonderful, wonderful smell and aroma of fresh homemade bread. The nicest thing about this bread is that it's going to make you 4 long braids or 2 braids and 1 iliotti, which is our olive bread that I told you we were going to be doing. Once it's properly wrapped, it'll freeze up to 6 weeks in the freezer so that you can go ahead and make a big batch like this and you'll have it in the freezer to use. Now start sprinkling on top of this the rest of the flour. And you'll be able to tell exactly how it should look because it won't be nearly as sticky as it was when I first took it out of the machine. Whenever you knead bread, you push it forward and then roll it back towards you. Push it forward and roll it back. Ah, yuck. Good thing to get the kids to help you do whenever you have a rainy or a snowy day, whatever the case might be. When children are at home, you can always get them to finish this last final procedure of your bread. All right, this is the rest of that flour. And this bread is ready. And what you have to do is let it rise double in capacity. Now I'll tell you the way I do it, which might be a little bit of a cheater's way. But I use what we call a baka bowl. And a baka bowl is merely a plastic bowl with a tight-fitting lid. And the reason I use the baka bowl is because it's already marked for me. And it tells me where I start and it tells me where the double point would be. So I simply put this in my baka bowl, put the lid on, and keep it in a warm place. And about 1.5 to 2 hours later, my dough has risen to the point where I want it. Okay, so here we have our baka bowl and our lid. And what we're going to do is take this dough that we've risen and we're going to put it right in the bowl. The whole idea now is to please be sure that your dough is even all the way around. Put the lid on it, put it in a warm place, and as I told you, in 2 hours it's going to have doubled in bulk. Since we don't have a 2-hour show for you today, and it would be pretty boring to watch the old bread dough rise, what we did, we took the liberty of going ahead and making you a batch of bread dough that is now risen. So imagine with me the 2 hours have passed, and we're going to take this and bring out, voila, the bread dough that we made 2 hours ago. And as you can see, it rose all the way to the top, which is okay. That's a little more than doubled, but at least now we know that it's risen. And we're going to take a little bit of flour on our hands, just like this, and punch it down gently. The reason you want to punch it down is, first of all, to get all the air bubbles out of the bread. That's very, very important. Back onto the floured board, can you see how much lighter this dough is now as compared to the dough that we were kneading just a few minutes ago? That's what the rising does. It makes a wonderful, light, sweet dough. And that way when you're eating it, It feels like you're almost biting into air. Only thing is, kids, it's not air at all. It's full of calories. But if you're going to indulge yourself in some calories and it's not chocolate, it might as well be this bread. Now I'm going to let it rest for just a few seconds. And while it's resting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to make the olive filling. That is so simple. All you have to do after you've cleaned your hands is saute in a small skillet in about 1/4 cup of butter. Okay. Some onion. And I would say you're looking at about 1/2 cup of an onion. 1 medium onion will do. Again, I'm using unsalted butter. And I've got here, already ready in my mise en place, 5 ounces of green olives that have been chopped and 8 ounces of a Greek black olive. And we use a Kalamata olive. And you can get that in any good specialty store. And we've also chopped them. Now it's lots easier to go ahead and get the green olives that have already been pitted, but unfortunately there's no Greek black olive that's been pitted, so you're going to have to go ahead and do that. But you can do that the night before and have that in the refrigerator, and then it's ready when you're ready to make the iliotti. Now right here we've already started melting our butter, and we have our onion that's been coarsely chopped. And it's 1 medium onion, 1/2 cup, 3/4 cup, whatever you think you'd like. Once the onion's been sauteed, it's nice and sweet, and it's only going to enhance the already filled bread. And while that's sauteing, I'm going to start cutting the bread and getting it ready to roll. What I'd like you to do for the iliotti is take this dough with a sharp knife and cut it at approximately the halfway point. Set the other half to the side. Make sure it's a little floured on the bottom, and we're going to make 2 braids out of that. What you have to do here is you have to get this dough rolled out into a rectangle approximately 12 by 18 inches. And the best way to do that is to reflour the board. And that means just a light dusting of flour. It would be terrible to have this stick to the board at this point. And if you start with a rectangle, it'll be a lot easier to make the form that you need. I have a pretty big rolling pin here, but that just makes my work a little easier. Flour the top, flour the board, and gently start pushing on that dough. As you can see, this dough even started raising a little bit more when we were making our filling. So it's very, very important that you work as quickly as possible. And it's got a lot of elasticity in it, and it's starting to come back. So you want to just play with it a little bit. Let it rest there for a second, because what we have ready to go are the onions and the olive mixture. And as you can see, they're getting translucent and just starting to turn golden brown. You want to be sure that those onions are totally cooked. Otherwise, once they're in that dough, they're not going to cook anymore. And that's when you're going to get a real bad aftertaste of onion. right, onions are ready, olives are ready. Mix everything together. If you'd like, you can season that with a little bit of pepper. Because of the olives being so salty, you're not going to need any salt, trust me. But if you'd like to add a little pepper, go right ahead. Okay. Best thing to do now is to let this mixture cool down, and it can be doing that while we finish rolling out our bread dough. All right, now that we've let our olive filling cool down just a little bit, we're going to go ahead and finish rolling this out. And in doing that, you want to keep in mind that general 12 by 18 inch rectangle. And although I don't have a ruler, I think I've done it enough that I can tell you that this is what it's supposed to look like. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here by adding this wonderful olive filling right on top of the bread dough. Doesn't that look good? And I'm going to spread it all over the dough. Boy, I'm really sorry you guys can't smell this because I want you to know it's fabulous. I'm going to take that and not go to the edge of the bread because it's going to be too hard to roll that way. So I'm leaving a good 2-inch border all over my dough. And what I want to do here is I want to roll it the long way. And the best way to do that is just to start rolling the dough towards my left, your right. And I want the seam side to be down. And you can push it towards you. You can see this bread's going to do just about anything you want. But you want it to look like a long baguette, like if you were making French bread. Even though that's not what this is, that's what its general appearance should look like in the initial instance. And I've gone ahead and I put a piece of parchment paper on a half cookie sheet, or a traditional cookie sheet for you folks, and I'm going to lift it up, seam side down, and I'm going to put it at an angle on my baking sheet. And the reason I'm doing it on an angle is because I want to get as much of this as I possibly can. And I also want to be able to make it as straight as possible, and I don't want it to be crimped in any way, shape, or form. It's not going to grow long ways, but rather it's going to grow forward and outward. So this way we know our length is safe, but we have to have enough room on the side so that it will raise properly. And I've gone ahead and I've beaten an egg. 1 whole egg will be enough of a glaze for both of these doughs that we're using today. And just get yourself a nice pastry brush. Right here. And go ahead and paint the bread dough with the egg. Now, the next step that you're going to want to do, and we'll do this all at one time when we're ready to raise our bread, is to get a wonderfully large piece of saran wrap and spray it with some kind of a non-stick spray and put it right on top of this pan. And if you're using a non-stick spray on your saran wrap, when you go to lift it off, it won't stick on your bread dough. If you want, you can put sesame seeds on this or poppy seeds, but a traditional iliotti is just left plain with a wonderful glaze coming out of the oven. And since we're going to be using sesame seeds on our braids, I think I'm just going to leave it plain for today. We're going to put this egg aside and put our iliotti aside and go ahead and take the other half of the bread dough and cut it in half. This will give us 2 braids. You're going to take each quarter now. This is 1/4 of the dough, and you're going to cut that into thirds. trying to make each third approximately the same. And you can pretty much feel in your hands when they're equal. Making sure again that your board has been floured, you're going to roll each third into a long snake. And each snake should be approximately 15 to 18 inches. You people who have braided little girls' hairs, or big boys' hairs, I guess. Some people have boys that want their hair braided. We won't discriminate. Will understand what I'm going to do when I start braiding my bread. You want also, please, to make sure that each one of these long snakes are even going down across. That's important, because that way your bread's going to come out even. And as you can see, they keep wanting to move in, but don't worry about that, because when we start braiding the bread, we're going to stretch it right back out. I have my 3 snakes ready. They are pretty much even. Well, I'm going to take all 3 pieces and I'm going to press them together like an anchor at the top. As I'm looking at the bread, I'm going to start with the part that's all the way to my right and bring it over the center piece. Then I'm going to take the piece that was all the way to the left and take it over the center piece. And I'm going to go right over the center, left over the center, right over the center, left over the center. And I'm going to keep going down, pulling each snake as I go. Tucking the very, very bottom and the very, very top, thus creating a perfect braid. I'm going to go ahead and brush this with the egg yolk, and as you can imagine, we'll make another one, put it alongside, brush them both with the egg, sprinkle them with sesame seed, and cover them with saran wrap that, as I told you before, has been treated with a non-stick glaze. Just take that spray and spray the saran wrap, cover the pan, keep them someplace warm until they've doubled in bulk. And when they've doubled in bulk, you can pop them right in the oven at 375 degrees for approximately 25 minutes. And when they come out of the oven, it's going to be up to you to keep them away from all the people that are going to be at your doorstep because they've smelled this wonderful bread aroma. So we're going to go ahead and get these ready, and in just a few minutes, actually more like 45 minutes to an hour, we'll be ready to bake them off. All right, again, through the magic of television, what we did was we allowed our bread to rise and double. Once that occurred, we put it in a 375-degree oven for about 30 minutes. Now, the olive bread's going to take a little more, but not much more, maybe about 35 minutes. So I want you to bear in mind the way that you know something is finished when you're baking bread is that you're going to tap it and it's going to sound hollow. Then you know your bread is finished. If it doesn't sound hollow, then you better keep it in the oven a little more. And what you also want is you want to make sure that it reaches this beautiful golden brown. And this is our iliotti. And our iliotti can be cut and served as a first course or as perhaps an appetizer in the living room with a nice glass of white wine or even champagne if you're going to get fancy. And I'm going to slice some down for you before I show you the bread, the braided bread, so that you have an idea. Now this is very hot, and I would recommend you letting it cool down somewhat before you go ahead and cut it for your guests or your family. But I want you to get the idea of what it should look like on the inside. We're going to cut off the end. And there. Isn't that just beautiful? That's your iliotti. And as I said, best to let it cool down somewhat. You don't want to serve it piping hot, but warm would be nice. So if you go ahead and you make it a little sooner than when your party is, you can pop it back in the oven for a few minutes, but cover it with some saran or aluminum foil. And then that way it'll be nice and warm, but not piping hot. Now let's go over to the braided Easter bread or the braided Greek bread or however you want to use it. And we'll put the iliotti over here to the side. Now I said the word Easter. Greek people traditionally do use this bread at Easter, but we found over the years that we like it so well, we use it all year long. And it's a lovely, lovely bread, and you'll find that you'll have it in your freezer and pull it out as you need to use it. Slice it down and perhaps a diagonal. This bread I love to serve warm with lots and lots and lots of butter. Some olives, some cheese, some wine. You don't need anything else, folks. You see how there aren't any air pockets in that bread? Yet it's as light as a feather, and that's what you want to achieve. So today you've learned 2 new breads using the same basic bread dough. I want you to please send for these recipes because I want to know that you're using them. Let us know what you think. Write to us, call us, do whatever. But make these recipes and enjoy. Hoping to see you again real soon. Bye-bye.